quadratics, which essentially mean the x-intercepts, but we're going to use a method called with square roots, and we'll get into that in just a minute. But before, we're going to review square roots in general. So a radical in math, that is just a word that describes any kind of root, like a square root, cube root, fourth root, whatever. And that symbol is this. And you've seen that, you're familiar with that. One thing that you have to be familiar with and know really well are your perfect squares. What does it mean to be a perfect square? Yes, it's perfect. It's like two of the same numbers multiplied together. So for example, what's 5 times 5? 25. 25 is a perfect square. So we're going to list out the first 15 perfect squares. So 1 times 1 is 1. 2 times 2. 3 times 3. Next. Good. Next. Keep going. Yep. 8 times 8. Come on. Nobody else know your multiplication? 81. 100. 121. They're on the side board over there. 144. 169, 196, 225. You really should have up through 12 memorized. To be honest, you should know those. If I say, what's 8 times 8, you should know 64. Or if I say, what's the square root of 49, you should know it's 7. Okay? Your life will be easier if you did. So the first thing we're going to do is work on simplifying square roots, which you have kind of seen early in the year when we were doing those ACT questions. First thing, we did that the first half of the year. And so we're going to do that a little bit right now. When you have a fraction, so we're taking the square root of 4 over 9. That is the same thing as doing the square root of 4 over the square root of 9. And what is the square root of 4? 2. What's the square root of 9? 3. So my answer is 2/3. The square root of 4/9 is 2/3. What that means is if I take 2/3 times 2/3, I would get 4/9. Number 2, we have the square root of 1 over 81, which is the same thing as having the square root of 1 over the square root of 81.
So if you can't do it to the top number, you can't do it to the bottom number?
To do what?
That would be the equation to solve it, right?
Yeah. What is the square root of 1?
1.
What's the square root of 81? 9. So your answer is 1/9.
Okay.
Now, number 3. This time, there is a number in the front. What that means is that I'm doing 2 times the square root of 144. And what is the square root of 144? 12. And 2 times 12 is 24. So my answer is 24. But look at number 4. Is 32 on your list of perfect squares? No. When you type in the square root of 32, you get a decimal. Do not put 5.6, 5.7, don't put that down. I do not want decimals. So here is how we simplify a square root. Just like I can do like dividing up here, you can split a number up, a radical up, into multiplying. So I can do square root of 32. I can rewrite that as 2 different radicals multiplied by each other. So I could write down any 2 numbers that multiply to be 32. But for this, I specifically want one of those numbers to be a perfect square, specifically the largest perfect square. So for example, there actually are 2 perfect squares, 4 and 16, that go evenly into 32. We want the biggest one. Okay. So 16 is the largest perfect square that goes into 32. 16 times what gives me 32? 16 times 2. So I split this up into the square root of 16 times the square root of 2. Now, what is the square root of 16? It is 4. When you take the square root, it's just plain 4. A lot of people want to rewrite a square root and do it again. Don't do that. You only do the square root once. And then this other one, you bring down the square root of 2. So your first one becomes a whole number. Your second one, just bring it down. And that's your answer. 4 square root of 2. Number 5. 12 is not a perfect square, which means I have to break it up. We want to know the largest perfect square that goes evenly into 12. So here's kind of how you would figure that out, especially if you don't know your multiplication tables. Start with 12. Now find the biggest number that's under 12. That would be 9. And start dividing. 12 divided by 9. Does 9 go evenly? No. 12 divided by 4. It goes evenly. So I'm going to make this the square root of 4 times the square root of 3. And what is the square root of 4? It's 2. And then bring down your other one, square root of 3. Good. Number 6, we have 112. That is not on my list, so I'm going to split it up. So 112, the first number that I would divide by would be 100. Is 100 going to go evenly into 112? Nope. So just go back one. I mean, if you typed in 100, it's fine. But you should know right off it's not going to go evenly. So go down to 81. 112 divided by 81. No, it's not a whole number. 112 divided by 64. Not a whole number. Keep going backwards in your list to find a whole number. And it took me a little while, but I found it when I got to 16. So I'm going to rewrite 112, or the square root of 112, as the square root of 16 times the square root of 7. And what is the square root of 16? It is 4. Bring down the square root of 7. Are there any questions? This is one, it may just take you a few minutes using the calculator to find your numbers. Number 7, we have the square root of 245. So, we can start with 225 and work my way down. And I found it. It's 49. 49 times 5 is 245. And what is the square root of 49? 7. Bring down the square root of 5. Number 8, notice there is a number in the front. So I have 5 times the square root of 72. And I know that I'm going to have to break apart the 72. So we need the biggest perfect square that goes into 72. So I'll probably start dividing with 64 and work my way back. And it's 36. If you had started with like 4 goes into 72, 9 goes into 72, and 36 goes into 72. So you need to start with your bigger numbers and work your way back. So this is 36 times 2. So I'm going to bring down my 5. What's the square root of 36? 6. Bring down the square root of 2. And so this 5, you only multiply it by the whole number. So you don't do 5 times 2 to get 10. You only multiply it by the whole number. And that becomes 30. And then you still bring down your square root of 2. See what you can do on number 9. Alright, so I have 3, and then I broke down the square root of 45. The largest perfect square that went into 45 is 9. So I have 3 from the front, the square root of 9, square root of 5. I still brought down that 3, and I know that the square root of 9 is 3. Bring down the square root of 5. And 3 times 3 is 9. Square root of 5. Okay. So we're going to use that to find the x-intercepts. When we have a quadratic. So we have an equation that's missing the bx. So that's the one in the middle. If it doesn't have a b term, so there's an x squared, there's a plain number, but there's not a plain x. The square root method that I'm about to show you works the best. What we do is we solve it like it's just like a two-step equation that you did in Algebra 1. And then we'll take the square root at the end. So, let's start here with number 1. If I was going to solve this for x, what would my first step be? Add 64 to both sides. Good. So those cancel. X squared equals, what's 0 plus 64? 64. My x is not by itself. I have x squared. The way you get rid of the squared is by taking the square root of both sides.
Really?
And so that makes this x. And what is the square root of 64? 8. When you have a problem with the quadratic, if you only put 8, you're only half correct. Here's why. If I look at the graph, where does the graph cross the x-axis? 8 and -8. When we're solving quadratics by square roots, you have to include the negative. You have to have a positive 8 and a negative 8. Because technically, negative 8 times negative 8 is still positive 64. So these graphs, if you only put 8, that's like you telling me that it only has one x-intercept at 8. But it actually has 2. Yes?
So whatever the answer is, the other answer is pretty much
The negative of that number. A lot of people, or sometimes you'll see it written like this, plus or minus 8. It just saves you a little writing. But what that means is positive 8 and negative 8. Either one is fine. So let's try number 2. What would my first step be?
subtract 8.
Subtract 8. And I have 7x squared equals 7. And then I
So for perfect squares.
divide by 7. Look, there was still a 7 in front of the x squared. We have to divide by that. And I get x squared equals what? 1. 7 divided by 7 is 1. And then how do I get rid of the squared? Take the square root. And what is the square root of 1? 1. But make sure you include negative 1 as well. You can put 1 and negative 1, or you can put plus or minus 1. Are there any questions? Okay. Number 3. What's my first step? Subtract 5. Good. And I get 81x squared equals 16. Oh, I just put 8, didn't I? 81. Then what? Divide by 81. You get a decimal. But let's just leave it as a fraction.
So, 81.
Look, 16 and 81 are both perfect squares. So we can do this.
That's 4 over 9.
If I take the square root of both sides, just like we did on the very first example, square root of the bottom. And I get plus or minus what? 4 over 9. Good. Number 4. What's my first step? Subtract 1 from both sides. And I get 8x squared equals 16. Then what?
You gotta divide by 8.
Divide by 8. X squared equals 2. Then what? Square root. Is 2 a perfect square? No. Are there any perfect squares besides one that actually goes into 2? Nope. So this cannot be broken down anymore. So we just leave it as x equals plus or minus square root of 2. It's okay if it doesn't break down at all. Sometimes that'll happen. Numbers like 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13, 15, 21 would not break down. Number 5. My first step is to add 9. And I get 2x squared equals 64. Then what? Divide by 2. X squared equals 32. Square root. Is 32 a perfect square?
No.
But could I find a perfect square that goes into 32?
Yeah.
Yeah. Guess what? We did this one on the front page. 16 What's the square root of 16? 4.
Yeah.
It's 4. Bring down square root of 2. Last one. Subtract 10 from both sides. And we get 5x squared equals 300. Then what? Divide by 5. Get 60. Then what? Square root. Well, I don't know what the largest perfect square is that goes into 60, so I'm going to figure it out. Oops. Well, I'm pretending I don't know it, so I'm going to show you how I would figure it out. Divided by 25. Yep. You're right, it's 4. 4 and 15. So I'm going to have x equals plus or minus, what's the square root of 4? 2. Bring down the square root of 15. Are there any questions?